Hi everyone, thank you for joining. We will be starting in the next few minutes. Hi everyone, thank you for joining. We'll be starting in the next couple of minutes. Hi, thanks for joining everybody. We will be starting in the next minute. Okay, we're at 2 o'clock. Over to you, Ian.
Welcome to this launch of a report on rethinking single-use plastics in travel and tourism, brought to you by the World Travel and Tourism Council and the UN Environment Programme. I'm Ian Taylor, a journalist with Travel Weekly in London, and I'm joined by a panel of experts to talk about the issue of removing single-use plastics. Plastics pollution attracted enormous attention before the pandemic, and though attention may have been elsewhere for the past 18 months or so, the problem's not gone away. Indeed, COVID health and safety measures have only exacerbated the problems. So there's added urgency to the discussion and the need for action. Travel and tourism's caught in a contradictory position as a significant contributor to plastics waste, but also risks the ruination of destinations by that waste. At the same time as having been on hold for most of the pandemic, the sector has an opportunity now to restart somewhat differently. And so that's going to be the subject of our discussion. We have an hour to look at some of the conclusions of the report. But first, we're going to hear from Virginia Messina, WTTC Senior Vice President for Advocacy and Communications. Virginia.
Thank you, Ian, for the great introduction. And on behalf of WTTC, I am pleased to welcome everybody to this very special webinar following the launch of our first joint report with the UN Environment Programme. We're delighted to have started this journey with UNEP and hope this is the setting point of a long-standing collaboration. So firstly, I would like to thank Elisa Tonda and the whole team at UNEP for their support and guidance through this process to raise awareness of this issue and ensure the report addressed the main challenges and provided sustainable and suitable alternatives to single-use plastic products. WTTC has indeed been working on accelerating its sustainability agenda since the launch of our first Climate and Environment Action Forum in New York in September 2019, where we set a series of ambitions for the sector, including addressing the issue of waste pollution and improving waste management to ensure that our sector thrives while preserving the environment. So with the advent of COVID-19, it has become even more pressing to address such issues, specifically in relation to the use of SUPPs, as these have been perceived to be safer and also provide protection. So in today's webinar, our panelists will discuss this challenge amongst others. The pandemic has certainly brought sustainability to the forefront, and it has emerged as a key priority for the global travel and tourism sector. We believe it is essential for the future development and long-term prosperity of our sector. So in this context, WTTC has been working closely with its members and the wider sustainability community. We set up a sustainability committee at board level formed by more than 12 CEOs that are committed to this issue, as well as a task force and working group of experts to define our strategy and ensure that as a sector, we make meaningful change and safeguard the communities, the natural ecosystems and cultural heritage upon which our sector depends. So in this regard, I would like to give special thanks to Daryl Wade, WTTC's Vice Chair of Sustainability and Chair of our Sustainability Committee, who has been leading our efforts in that direction and who we will be hearing from next. So without further ado, I thank you again for joining us today. I wish you a great session. We know from travel and tourism, we can be part of the solution to have a more sustainable future. And so I would like now to introduce Daryl Wade, the chairman and co-founder of the Intrepid Group and WTTC's Vice Chair of Sustainability. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Virginia. I think this is the first WTTC involved webinar that I've ever been involved in that hasn't said the obvious statistics about the size of our industry. I think we all know it, but it needs to be said again that up until the pandemic, our travel and tourism industry accounted for 1 in 10 jobs globally and 10.4% of global GDP. It's a huge industry. And with that huge size comes great responsibility. And I think perhaps our industry hasn't always been the best in the past at looking at that responsibility and taking it on board. But I'm really pleased to say that it is changing. It has changed over the last few years. And right now there's a significant uptake of awareness around that responsibility. And as Virginia was saying, 6 months ago, we formed a new committee at the WTTC specifically to look at sustainability and the various forms and impacts that that has, one of which is single-use plastics, as we're talking about today. I'm really thrilled, though, that the committee formed, but we're called for expertise across our member companies, and we've got over 40 different member companies and 40 different experts looking at particular issues in our industry that needs addressing. And as I was saying, one of those is single-use plastics. It's also great that the WTC and our industry is starting to look beyond ourselves. And so in that context, it's really fantastic to be working with the UNEP on this particular project. And so it gives me great pleasure to help co-launch this report tonight or today. And this report is a little bit personal for me. you know, as a traveller over the years, I guess I've got more and more concerned about the issue of plastics, and because it's visible. You know, we see it on our beaches, we see it in our national parks, we see it in our cities, and it's just a really thing you can manifest. And so about 25 years ago, my own company started a campaign, as you can kind of see here, to say no to plastics. And we issued all our travellers with one of these bags so that when they walked along the beach or went shopping to markets or local shops or whatever and did some purchases, rather than collect yet another plastic bag, they could put it in a cloth bag that was reusable forevermore. And these bags started to become a bit of a collector's item, and people would use them back at home and collect the next one on the next trip. And why I'm telling you that little story is because it shows what one relatively small member can do if they put their minds to it, because we've saved literally hundreds of thousands of plastic bags just by taking a relatively small measure. And so today we've got a few hundred people on this webinar. If all of you and all of your companies that you represent take one small measure, or maybe 2 or 3 measures, then what a difference we could make. But perhaps the first thing you can do is actually to download this report and have a good read of it. It's a fantastic report for identifying the problems and then looking at some of the pathways and some of the solutions that are available to us, because solutions are there. And then go that next step further and start to create change within your own organizations and within your own patterns yourself. Because ultimately, reports are terrific, but they're only reports. Things only really change when you take personal action, and we really need, as an industry, to step up and take those responsibilities and actions ourselves. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attendance, but also urge you to hang on, because we've got an action-packed show. And in particular, hand over to Elisa Tonda from the UNEP to show the other side of the launch. Elisa.
Thank you very much, and good day to everybody connected. And I'm really pleased to welcome you all today to the launch webinar of the report Rethinking Single-Use Plastic Product in Travel and Tourism. And I'm even delighted even more to see so many connected from all around the world. Prior to maybe entering a little bit more into the context, let me first start by thanking very much the World Travel and Tourism Council, WTTC, for the great and inspiring collaboration that we've had during the past month. And indeed, we also believe that this is going to be a first step in a longer journey together. As said, I just wanted to put some elements of context to our conversation today and to the discussion that we're going to have during this webinar. And remind us that marine ecosystem services actually make up for over 60% of the economic value of all life on Earth. They support the livelihood of over 3 billion people, including people from the travel and tourism sector. And they are an essential ally in our fight against climate change. But the environment, and particularly the marine environment, is actually currently under attack from our current production and consumption patterns. It has become a dumping ground of all different types of pollution, from plastic to toxic chemicals. And plastics actually represent the largest, most harmful, and most persistent proportion of marine litter. It has been estimated that the cumulative loss and direct impact of marine plastic on the services that marine ecosystems are offering to us amounts to something between 500 to 2,500 billion US dollars per year. And as anticipated by the former speakers, this situation has actually been aggravated during the COVID-19 pandemic. Masks, gloves, and other disposable items that are an important part of the COVID-19 response are actually threatening to bring us back in our fight against disposable plastic, marine litter, and microplastics, especially in countries with weak waste management infrastructure. And the effects are actually unprecedented. As referred again to by some of the previous speakers, we start seeing disposable masks washing up on coast from California to Hong Kong. And the global plastic packaging market size is actually projected to grow from a size of 900 billion in 2019 to more than 1,000 billion in 2021. And again, as referred to by some of the former speakers, some of the miscommunication around the safety of plastic in the context of health has also rolled back some of the progress in promoting policies and practices aimed at reducing plastic pollution. So this context is really calling us for a need of the urgency to act now. And we believe that travel and tourism has really a key role to play in reversing these trends, in changing our unsustainable consumption and production patterns, and making circularity in the use of plastic a reality. We therefore believe that this report will really play a fundamental role and a fundamental push in UNEP's efforts towards a more circular system for plastic. And among the efforts that we would want to feed with the very substantive information of this report is, for example, the Global Tourism Plastic Initiative, which unites the sector behind a common vision of tackling plastic pollution through circularity, even in COVID times. And testimony of this effort is the fact that this initiative has developed specific recommendations to continue tackling plastic pollution, while at the same time taking care of the emerging needs and priorities of the COVID-19 recovery. And just to reflect the fact that this Global Tourism Plastic Initiative is not alone, is actually part of a broader initiative, which is the New Plastics Economy Global Commitment, led by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation and supported by the United Nations Environment Programme, an initiative that brings together more than 500 actors and pulls together the global plastic packaging industry, more than 20% of plastic packaging which is currently in the market, and governments from across all 5 continents. Not only initiatives at global level are the ones where we feel those recommendations will be particularly relevant, but also in all our work in countries across the globe. And all those efforts will actually need to allow us to embrace and engage all different kinds of actors in the system. Citizens, governments, and industries that are associated with these sectors, all of them in their different roles along the plastic value chain have really the potential to act now, to make the change that we need to shift towards more responsible consumption and production. We really hope that with this report, we will encourage all of these stakeholders in the industry to come together to address these complex and multifaceted challenges. Only by working together and accelerating the speed of our transition and the change in the tourism industry, we will be able to make plastic waste and pollution a thing of the past and truly build back better and greener. All of you participants, I wish all of you a very, very interesting webinar. And Jan, I give the floor back to you.
Thank you, Elisa. Let me introduce the panel. So please welcome virtually Jonas Leones, Undersecretary for Policy Planning and International Affairs at the Philippines Department of Environment and Natural Resources. Welcome, Jonas. Megan Morikawa, Global Director of Sustainability at Iberostar Group. Welcome, Megan. Andreas Vermeulen, Manager for Sustainability and the Circular Economy Sustainable Development at TUI. Welcome, Andreas. And Joe Hendricks, co-founder of Travel Without Plastics and an author of the report. A couple of points just before we start the discussion. We'll hear a lot in the next 3/4 of an hour about SUPPs. That stands for single-use plastic products. The report will be available via a link towards the end of the webcast. The web launch will be available to view subsequently on the WTTC site. And please do ask questions through the Q&A function, not the chat function, because if you ask through the chat function, I might miss them. So use the Q&A, please, and I'll take as many of your questions as I can. Joe, if I can come to you first, who is the report aimed at? It's very detailed, I should say. It's a very, very good report, very detailed. Who's it for?
Thank you. There's a range of audiences. So predominantly our focus was to appeal to businesses, to tourism businesses, large and small, whether they're independent businesses or global organisations, but also to appeal to policymakers as well. And again, that being at regional, national and international levels. We didn't really have the space to make it ready for consumers. I think it was too much. We couldn't fit all of that into the report, but actually if anybody was to read it as a consumer, I think they'd be able to get some good takeaways there as well, but predominantly for the travel and tourism business and anybody that's involved in that throughout the value chain. So not just, you know, the businesses that would come to mind as airlines, hotels, cruise ships, etc., but those that are supplying the travel and tourism sector as well.
Okay, Daryl and Elisa have highlighted the size of the sector and the key role it has to play in this. Just quickly summarize the key recommendations of the report.
They're very practical. We wanted everything that we contained within the report to be recommendations that people could go and do straight away. And to be honest, when I was writing some of these, I was a little bit concerned that they would be too basic. There are recommendations in there about putting bins on lids, but you know, you can go everywhere and see bin bags flailing around and people that have taken the time and energy to put rubbish away properly. You know, it's almost like, gosh, we need to go back to basics. So we very much intended it to be doable, practical recommendations that will help people to collaborate and consider what their part is in the puzzle and the whole kind of the workings of that and how they can collaborate together so that the change really happens and we can really drive that positively.
Okay. Jonas, Undersecretary, if I can come to you, what's the situation in the Philippines with single-use plastic products? Is the Philippines a victim of single-use plastic waste, or is it a perpetrator, or both, perhaps?
Well, it's a comprehensive approach at the national, regional, and especially at the global level is required to address single-use plastic products. Since the adoption of the SDGs, many voluntary initiatives have been implemented across the globe, across regions and by nations, but they still have fallen short, bringing us closer to our goal of eliminating plastic pollution. Therefore, a strong global framework that takes into account the full life cycle approach of plastic products and the shift towards a circular economy is urgently needed to solve this global problem on single-use plastic products pollution. The Philippines recognizes the important work of the different regional programs and bodies to address plastic pollution, particularly caused by single-use plastic products. Specifically, the country is engaged in ASEAN, the COBSEA, the PEMSEA, and the CTI, among others, since a comprehensive, integrated, and multi-tiered approach is needed to address plastic pollution. It is critical that these various regional programs, as well as the national interventions, are aligned and should build on each other. Regional governance through coordinating bodies should create synergy among themselves. This could include strengthening communication and coordination among programs, rationalizing plans to avoid duplications and address gaps, consolidation information, and minimizing redundant double reporting. Thank you, Ian.
Okay, thank you very much, Jonas. Megan, can I ask you? I saw an interview with you in March where you said our operations at Iberostar are free of single-use plastics. Is that true, and how did you do it?
It is true, and it actually was something that we achieved last year, and I think this is one of the really key takeaways that I wanted to bring to this panel as well. So at Iberostar, with our Wave of Change movement, we've committed to removing all single-use plastics from our operations last year by 2020, and then also sending no waste to landfill in all of our operations by 2025. And I think this is a really important component because there's a little bit of a sticky behavior change to it too, because once you see a room or a hotel experience without single-use plastics, without single-use amenities, without cups that are wrapped in plastic packaging, it's hard to unsee it, right? And you go into another room and you always just see these experiences and you really just wonder, is this really necessary? But for us, when we removed single-use plastic products, or basically products that were totally or partially made with plastic that had been conceived, designed, or introduced in the market to be used once or for a short period of time before disposal, what we realized was that we needed to do this in a way that was scientifically informed and also responding correctly to the pandemic. So our medical advisory board was giving us recommendations about health and hygiene and safety throughout the process, while we were also responding to the pandemic, removing single-use plastics from our buffet operations, from the rest of the operations that we had. And what we realized is that, what was most important was that we made sure that our client safety went first, and that did not need to come at the cost of increasing our consumption of single-use products. We could use reusable products and ensure that our cleaning methodologies were at place and the training was at the level that it needed to be for our staff to be able to implement that. Most importantly, 2 lessons were learned, right? The first is we achieved the work and had an incredible response in the health and safety with our How We Care measures. But the second, which I think is the most amazing, is that all tourism in the last year needed to make drastic operational changes across their services, their product, and their supply chain to respond to the pandemic. So once we demonstrated that this was possible to do rapidly and at scale, I think it also opens up a new pathway for us to all say, if we take that same serious approach to doing things like removing single-use plastics from our operations, we've already demonstrated it's possible in times of crises. And so this is something that we can also scale again today.
Okay, you will have had a much smaller number of guests, though, through the last months, won't you, because of the pandemic? So did that make it easier to go through this process of change, and will you be able to scale it up?
It's actually quite the opposite, right? Because we had all of the employees still on staff trying to figure out how to make all of these changes in addition to the health and safety measures, in addition to adjusting our operations relative to the number of staff accordingly. And then adding on top of that, responding to continuing to remove all single-use plastics from our operations. We see this as very scalable because we made fundamental changes to some of the services that we were providing, right? We made fundamental changes to the room service, to have new ways to be able to cover items that go into room service. We made fundamental changes to the purchasing that we had for items that were within the rooms, et cetera. And so the scaling part is actually going to be relatively straightforward, including a business case for cost savings for items that were not necessary to begin with. This is the best for circular economy, best for companies recovering, is source aversion, right? If you don't need it, don't purchase it. And so we see this as imminently scalable.
Okay, very good. Andreas, can I come to you? TUI provides one of the case studies in the report. Tell us about that.
Well, yeah, we are really happy to have the opportunity to provide our activities as a case study to that report. And actually, I think in terms of what we have done and what is visible in that case study, maybe I can give you some more details on that. So single-use plastic reduction has been a really important aspect of TUI Group. And for that reason, as an example, TUI Group has set the target in 2018 already to remove 250 million pieces of single-use plastic waste by 2020. And through the joint efforts across our hotels, cruise lines, airlines, and so on, we were able to remove 257 million pieces of single-use plastic. And maybe to make it a little bit more tangible, I would like to provide you with some more details. So across our hotel operations, we were able to remove 297 million pieces of single-use plastic, for example, plastic cups, straws, bottles, and so on. And in order to give our hoteliers useful information, so what they should do or what they should leave, we conducted a plastic reduction workshop, which was held in October 2019 in cooperation with Jo and her team from Travel Without Plastic. And more than 30 participants from our hotel brands, TUI Blue, Robinson, TUI Magic Life, participated in that workshop. And the main focus of that workshop was to explain further what our hotels could do in order to reduce single-use plastic items. But also across our our cruise operations, so we were able to remove 31 million pieces of single-use plastic items, mainly driven by TUI Cruises' ambitious Wasteless program, which is aiming to eliminate unnecessary plastic products. And we are also supporting destinations in plastic waste reduction. So for instance, the TUI Care Foundation, in cooperation with the Travel Foundation and the Cyprus Sustainable Tourism Initiative, they have set up a project which is called Keep Our Sand and Sea Plastic Free in Cyprus. And they're helping hotels, bars, and restaurants to reduce single-use plastics. But for sure, we also have faced several challenges. For example, it is absolutely key to raise awareness of plastic pollution with our colleagues and partners to encourage them to take action. And another obstacle would be that sometimes single-use plastic, we have mentioned that before, single-use plastic might be more cost efficient in the short term and alternatives might need higher initial investment, but they are usually paid off within a few weeks or months. So it's about getting the business and our partners to understand it. And another challenge has been the availability of sustainable alternatives in good quality, because this can greatly vary from destination to destination. So you need to fully understand the impact of the alternatives, because they may look quite sustainable in the beginning, but they may cause some problems somewhere else. And for sure, the COVID-19 pandemic also has had an influence on the use of single-use plastic items within our operations. But with TUI's approach, I think we have overcome many of these challenges and to continue reducing single-use plastics across our businesses.
Okay, the numbers you quoted are large, obviously, but I don't have a sense from them about what sort of proportion of single-use plastics have disappeared from TUI properties now. So can you give me a percentage? Is it 50%, 90%?
Well, that's a little bit tricky to say, because our reporting was mainly facing on the calculating or estimating the savings which has been done. But actually, it is definitely also on our agenda to see what is the total amount of plastics which is within our operations, which is a little bit more tricky. As you can imagine, we are a vertically integrated company, a group with hotels, with cruises, with airlines, with different reportings, and we need to align that. And actually, within the coming months, we are going to align that, and hopefully, then we will be able to provide you with a ratio.
Okay, Joe, can I come back to you? What are the barriers to removing single-use plastics? I know Travel Without Plastics talks about habit and traditional operating procedures holding things back. What are the barriers?
I think, well, they've been described a little bit by Andreas there and by Megan. I think really habit is a huge thing, actually, and it's one of the biggest challenges that hoteliers tell us that they face. And it's usually because the people that are working in the hotels have been there for such a long time. You know, some of the staff are in their roles for 25 or 30 years. So asking them to make quite significant changes, it can be quite difficult for them. And that really is what comes back. So we focus a lot on training, on linking that training to the emotional side of seeing the single-use plastic in the destination, understanding how that's impacting, you know, the people that live in destinations as well as the people that are traveling there. But what worked well, and we demonstrated this with the workshop that we did with TUI and Andreas, is getting staff together from different departments around the table and looking at what those challenges are, but asking them to help each other. And a lot of the time, it's somebody from outside of, let's say, the food and beverage department that would have the answer through the food and beverage department, because you're a little bit removed and you can kind of see things differently, suggest other changes. And what we see then is that we get real interest from different members of the team wanting to help and support each other. And once those habits and changes can be overcome and driven by the staff, then they're much more likely to succeed. But equally, I think, as Andreas mentioned, it's confusion as well around what is actually a sustainable alternative. And the tendency that we found when we were doing the research for the report, it's very much, we're going to replace single-use plastic with single-use something else. And there's not necessarily this focus on waste reduction. And that's not speaking for everybody. In some cases, you know, there is that the waste hierarchy forms part of the decision making, but generally there's a tendency to switch single use for single use. And so what we really want to drive is, you know, as Megan said, do we actually need some of these products in the first place, or if we just use them for such a long time that it's almost unthinkable to take them out? But I think COVID gives us that opportunity now, where we're used to having to make so many operational changes. Travelers are used to seeing change and having to accept change. And it's almost given us the, you know, the permission, if you like, to question some of these things that have gone on for such a long time and the procedures, and really look into the logical decisions that are made when businesses are choosing single-use plastic to create a safe environment, because sometimes that's really not the case. If, and you know, in the worst case scenario, it can actually be another vehicle for transmission as well as the pollution it causes. So it's really looking at logical decision making. You know, you can use the stickers on the door of hotels as an example. That doesn't tell you that the room is clean. That tells you nobody has been into that room since the sticker was stuck on the door. It's the process of cleaning the room that means the room is clean. So I think if we can put this processes over products approach, and that's one of the barriers, it's harder to do, but people are starting to see the logic behind that now, and that's something we want to push a little more.
Okay, just quickly, aside from COVID, why is there a focus on single use? What's the attraction of single use products?
I think over time, it's been the answer to health and safety in many ways. So you can't have glass around a swimming pool, for instance. So it's much easier, it's cheaper in the shorter term, and it's quicker to have single-use plastic as a product than it is to put the processes in place for reusable products. But I think as well, there is that perception from guests and from people that travel that single use is more hygienic, is more safe anyway. It's almost like you're the first person to touch this product. But that's where I think it's a bit illogical. So if you think about sitting down in a restaurant, whether it's on a cruise ship or in a hotel, and you know, everyone's quite happy to use a stainless steel knife or fork or eat off a ceramic plate, yet somehow using a reusable straw, which would go through the exact same dishwashing process, is unhygienic. And you know, we had that kind of response before COVID. So there's a mentality that we need to overcome, and I think that people just trust single use more. But it's easy to come by, it's lightweight, which is great for travel, and some of the alternatives aren't as green as they seem, and can create a new set of problems. I think we all know where we are with single-use plastic, and that's one of the reasons it's been around for so long. Okay,
it amazes me, because it's miserable to go to a restaurant and have plastic forks and a paper plate or something, isn't it? Megan, can I come to you and ask you the same question? Why the focus on single use, and what are the barriers? But also, sorry to ask you multiple questions. I have a question from one of the attendees. Can you give us a concrete example of the changes to your operations you've made?
Absolutely. And I think in addition to a lot of the really great comments that Joe made, you know, convenience is another reason why a lot of people use single-use items. And I think that it's important too, when you're in various ecosystems, you're going from the airport to a hotel and you've got transportation in between, it definitely becomes harder to be able to have something within an entire ecosystem. And this is one of the advantages that we had at Iberostar, is that most of our products are all-inclusive vacational resort hotels, right? And so as a result, we take care of the entire experience. We want you to feel well taken care of. And in fact, you know, the stainless steel option is more luxurious than the plastic option in many instances. And so there were many lines that were able to intersect in that capacity. But I think what that convenience, it's important to recognize that's on two sides, right? It's on the convenience of someone to be able to go into a cafe and take their coffee away and have it in various settings, but it's also much more convenient for the staff logistically, right? To not have to recollect items, wash items, ensure new standards and protocols were a part of it. And so this is where we spent a lot of our focus, is focusing in on those procedural changes and bringing in reuse options. For example, we decided to remove all, not only single-use plastic water bottles, but single-use water bottles altogether from all of our resorts in the Americas and in the Caribbean, where there are not local sources of potable water. So we installed hundreds of reverse osmosis fountains that also added incredible purity and taste. Vero Water is a company that a lot of Michelin star restaurants use in the US. We implemented all of this system with reusable glass bottles in our resorts, and that's one of the examples that we use as an alternative for a single-use item. And again, it took a little bit to learn how it is that you implement a new process, right? A new process for being able to remove these items. But as Andreas was also saying, you know, there is a return on that investment, and it's just about figuring out when that timing is. In the food service, and I think that this is one of the areas where folks ask the most questions about how do you actually achieve single-use plastics free in food service. One important component is that we do this within legal restrictions, right? So if for hygiene and safety reasons, the local law, and it's important to also recognize that different countries and different regions have different laws around whether or not a sufficient silicone cover is, you know, hygienic enough, or whether it's required to be a cling film, et cetera. So that there's variability that needs to be accounted for in that capacity. But in terms of the buffet experience, what we ended up doing was having that same philosophy with the glass water bottles. We had, in fact, from our juices that were in the rooms, our glass bottles and that, they would recollect a certain portion of that and then wash those bottles and reutilize those for the juice services. And so instead of having a pitcher, they would have single serve glass juices that you could take. And then after the food service, they would take those bottles back and wash them again. And so just basically increase the volume of the ceramic plates and the, you know, stainless steel knives to the other items that replace the single-use items in the food service process. We also relied on our medical advisory board to give us recommendations about surfaces and hygiene. You should have one touch system so that a client is able to kind of take away one item, or you should have acrylic panels and have service allow for serving items instead of having the clients serve themselves. All of these were some of the solutions that we put in place to be able to respond to the pandemic and also to removing single-use plastics.
Okay. Got lots of questions coming in. I'm not going to be able to ask all of them, but I'll do my best. Jonas, can I ask you, what are the barriers as a destination to removing single-use plastic products?
Well, Ian, in the Philippines, because of the autonomy of the local government units, ordinances regulating single-use plastic products have already been enacted before onset of the pandemic. Most of the regulated items are for the thin-filled plastics that are used to wrap goods in small quantities or retail, depending on the local communities circumstances, which vary a lot due to archipelagic nature of the country, distance to urban centers, and economic disparities. LGUs either limit regulations on the use of single-use plastic products for dry goods, impose levies on SUPPs, or outright ban specific types of unnecessary SUPs. The pandemic has paved the way for e-commerce to flourish in the Philippines because of its flexibility and a wide variety of choices that can be brought with just a few clicks. Waste products because of the additional protective packaging for products, although offsetting waste generation from schools and most offices. Implementation of some of the local ordinances were suspended during the first few months of the pandemic for health and public safety reasons. However, it's also this pandemic that somehow awakened our countrymen, consumers, that are now willing to forgo convenience and disposability of, and are ready to hold refill and alternative delivery systems whenever practical. Early this year, Ian, the Philippines has started listing non-environmentally accepted products that will eventually be prohibited. First on the list are the necessary single-use plastics, which are the plastic soda straws and plastic coffee stirrers. We have proven that during the pandemic, we can still identify non-environmentally acceptable products that will prohibit without sacrificing the protection of health of the public and support small businesses that require less expensive packaging materials to preserve and protect their product as part of the government-led green economic recovery.
Okay, thank you. And thank you. Andreas, can I ask you, this is a question that's come in from an attendee. What single-use plastic products are hardest to find a sustainable alternative for?
Well, there's quite a range of single-use plastic items which we are going to remove or to replace with more sustainable alternatives. What we recognize is that, especially also Joe was mentioning that, you know, change of mindset. We need to talk to our colleagues. We need to talk to the guests. We need to talk to our suppliers. But especially plastic bottles, also in times of COVID-19, has been quite a challenge, because if you have water dispensers which are publicly available, many people still think that it's contaminated, or that there are certain things which are not hygiene as they require. I think plastic bottle is really top number one, because many other things like straws, like steerers or whatsoever, guests and colleagues are quite confident, okay, we can find a good sustainable solution to that. But they still want to have that, well, they think it's the clean plastic bottle, and they want to open it freshly and things like that. But from our experience, so from a sustainability point of view at TUI Group, water dispensers, for example, on board of our cruise ships of TUI Cruises, it's working very well. So on board, in the cabins of our guests, there are glass carafes, and they can get their own water whenever they like it, and they don't need to go somewhere. It's just on the floor. And I think there are really good alternatives. But what is absolutely essential is that we talk to our guests, that we talk to our colleagues, and that we talk to suppliers to identify good solutions.
Okay, I've a question here that, Joe, maybe one for you. How environmentally friendly is single-use paper when used to replace single-use plastic?
It's going to sound like a get out, but it depends. It always depends, and I think that's the thing with the different solutions, that so much depends on how they're used, where they're used, the behavior of people when they use them, and then how they're disposed of at the end of life, and, you know, whether or not they become pollution or not. So in the report, we give an example of paper bags, so single-use paper bags versus single-use plastic bags, and looking at the research that's been done on that, there's an average of having to use the paper bag between 4 and 8 times in order for it to have the same environmental footprint as a single-use plastic bag. But what we tried to capture in that section of the report as well is that there are operational trade-offs, not just environmental or social trade-offs, that come with these alternative solutions. So if the paper bag can be used that many times, great. But if it's going to be used to carry wet food, cold food, and it's going to disintegrate pretty quickly, then probably it isn't a great idea. But at the same time, if the paper bag is littered for whatever reason, or it finds its way to becoming a piece of pollution, then of course that's going to degrade much more quickly than a plastic bag. So the balance can tip quite a lot, really depending on the end of life infrastructure that's there. So it's not a straightforward answer. And what we tried to do through the report, and if anyone's seen it already, you'll have seen the decision trees, and they don't talk about paper bags particularly, but what they try to get everybody to think about is what are the pros and cons, at each potential decision point, but for you specifically, for your region, for your business, for your customer demographic, for your budget. And then the answer comes from there. It's very much an individual answer.
Okay. One more specific question, just quickly. Plastic cling film is a real issue in kitchens. How can that be use of that be eliminated? It
depends again what it's being used for. Megan mentioned earlier that you can have silicone lids. And there are ones that will actually fit a bain-marie size, buffet container. So it depends what they're being used for. I think if you've got, like one of those push trolleys where you're putting desserts that you can't necessarily put a cling film top on, then there are actually reusable covers that can go around those trolleys that don't have to be made of cling film and can be washed. There are new innovations coming onto the market now of bio and compostable cling film that we've not tested, we don't know, but we'd love to hear from anybody that has got really great ideas for cling film, because it really is one of the most complicated products for businesses to eliminate or replace.
Okay, nobody said this was going to be simple, did they?
No.
Megan, can I ask you, can a group like Iberostar basically dictate to its suppliers you know, the products it receives and how it receives them and so on, or is that a complicated discussion to get collaboration throughout your supply chain?
So it's a good question, and you use some interesting words there, right? And I would almost kind of flip it on its head and say dictate is possible, but is our less ideal option, because strong relationships with our providers is something that Iberostar prides itself in. And in those strong relationships, there needs to be a lot of kind of empathy and listening to both sides, right? What is feasible and doable in this sort of capacity? How do we find this intersection of quality, of price, and of our rules and regulations and sustainability as a result of that? What's really interesting too, and one of the reasons as well why I very much like, especially when we're working with groups like the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, that we kind of move from the single-use plastic terminology and towards problematic plastic packaging and items, right? What are the problematic items, irrespective of whether or not they're multi-use or single-use, et cetera. And I think what's also very important to recognize is that a provider is one step of the chain, right? They might not have as much information about their packaging, or they might not have information about how their items are shipped, right? The pallet wrap that goes around how their items are shipped. And so I think you start with the items themselves, because you can ask, I want this item or I don't want this item. But fighting the packaging and fighting the shipping process is a much more complicated area where you need to think more holistically about how providers are willing to and to listen to some of their challenges, but also opportunities for them to be able to shift some of the ways in which they're doing business. And ideally, the sticky part is if they say, oh, wow, this is feasible for me not only to do for you as a client, but for many of our clients in the region or in the country. And if they can solve questions of reverse logistics, if they can solve questions about packaging, or the simplest is just solve questions about what size is the item, right? Buying in bulk is some of the easiest ways to be able to avoid a lot of problematic plastic packaging. And if they can help us to solve those sorts of questions, they become solutions that are available for the destinations. But it really requires this kind of collaboration and listening and empathy on both sides.
Okay. Jonas, can I ask you a similar question, but from the other side? How much control do destinations have over multinational companies, you know, bringing tourists to your country? Can you dictate the standards on single-use plastics and so on, or do you largely have to just follow what the company decides to do?
Our department in the government is a regulator, Ian. So even if the company will bring single-use plastic, they need to comply with our regulations. In the case of, like for example, big companies, multinational companies, they cannot dictate the government. In this case, we have a policy now that we ban single-use plastics like plastic stirrers, plastic bottles. So because we believe that if we allow them to use single-use plastics, usually they end up in our rivers, water bodies, and it's very difficult to clean these water bodies. Considering that our country is archipelagic and we have a lot of water bodies, so if we will allow them to dictate us on what they want to do, then it will not be, we will not compromise and we will not agree on that policy.
So if I was to open a hotel in the Philippines, I couldn't give guests or sell guests plastic water bottles?
Yes, we have industry now. We have been coordinating with associations of hotels that gradually they should be eliminating these single-use plastics, like plastic. They use like alternative like bamboo or steel, but because these are recyclables, or these can be reusable. But for single-use plastic, I think we have already advised some of our hotels that they reduce the use of the single-use plastics.
Okay. So this is guidance, if you like, rather than firm regulation. Andreas, can I ask you, would you Is there sufficient regulation of the sector? Would you like to see more? Because TUI can do all the things you're doing, but your competitors may not be bothered and be polluting the destinations you're taking customers to.
But I think there are two sides of that medal, so to say. So on the one side, we have our intrinsic motivation, because we at TUI Group, we would like to reduce single-use plastic, and we would like to, make our business plastic-free and more sustainable in future. And we are keeping working on that also with our upcoming sustainability strategy, which will have a strong focus on circular economy. So this is what we would like to do. In terms of legislation, for sure, there's more and more legislation coming up, not only about plastic, but about sustainability in general. And I think this is a good sign, because it shows everybody that sustainability is not just a nice to have anymore, but that it's a crucial aspect in order to ensure that future generations still have a good planet to live on, so to say. But legislation is just, again, it's just one part of that medal, and it depends also on how the legislation is designed, so to say, how it is, what is really facing, and whether it really has a benefit in the end, or whether it's just a legislation which is nice to have, but nobody really needs to apply to that. For that reason, I think both is good. Legislation is good to have a kind of baseline, so it's something everybody needs to stick to and need to adhere to. But apart from that, I think, personal but also cooperative motivation and engagement is absolutely crucial in order to move forward.
Okay, Joe, we're running out of time. Several of you have mentioned consumers' awareness of this, and the report suggests consumers are making more conscious choices. Would you say there's consumer pressure to act?
Yeah, I think there is actually. I think Megan made a good point early on. Once you go to a hotel and you see that it can operate without single-use plastic, you start to wonder why everybody else can't do the same. And I think, as you mentioned yourself, that the idea of a quality experience doesn't go hand in hand with single-use plastic products being in whichever business it is that you choose to frequent as part of your holiday. So I think there's expectation around that. The research that's been released just a few days ago by Booking.com, for instance, shows that there really is a pressure, I think, coming from the consumers, but the expectation is that the businesses will make it easy for the consumers to reduce single-use plastic. And I think that's the key thing. There's a gap, isn't there, between what consumers say they want and then what they're prepared to actually do themselves to reduce single-use plastic. And on a recent webinar in Cyprus, a hotel said to us there, everybody, they complained about plastic water bottles and asked us to move them away. When we moved them away, they complained that it wasn't very easy to get water, and how are they supposed to take, heavy water bottles down to the beach? So I think there's that juxtaposition between what people want and how far they're willing to go. And in some instances at the moment, I think the effort that needs to be made by people is just a little bit too much. And if we can make those sustainable options by putting in lots of different water filtration systems in hotels, easily accessible, people can get to them quickly, we make the sustainable choice the easiest, the most attractive and most available choice. And that's what we need to do to respond to the customer pressure.
Okay, Megan, very quickly now, I'm afraid, is removing single-use plastics compatible with luxury travel? Iberostar's 4- and 5-star hotels, people are used when they go to a 4-star, 5-star hotel to go to the spa and find all these personal luxury items. Aren't they? Packaging's frequently a part of luxury goods, the emphasis on the exceptional, on excess, on individual pampering and so on. Is it compatible?
It is compatible. I think the trickier question is it also compatible with budget traveling, right? That's the real question that we really need to be answering. And it is something that ideally we would like all of these products to be quality and not impacting the environment in a negative way, no matter what the price range or price entry point is around this. But Joe's definitely making a lot of good points that, you don't want to hear the crinkle of the plastic when you're having your food service. You would like to have something that's fabric or is metal and ceramic or of a higher quality. But the real question is if we can also do this across all of parts of the segmentation and supply chain.
Okay. We've run out of time almost, so I'm just going to ask each of you for one key takeaway. What's the most important next step, or what's the most important lesson you've learned? And Andreas, maybe we could go to you first.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think the issue of plastic, also the discussion, the panel discussion today has shown that the issue of plastic is more complex than it looks like in the beginning. Therefore, I think fighting against plastic pollution together and working in teams and together with our suppliers and so on is absolutely crucial. And for that reason, we at TUI Group, we will continue our work on plastic reduction by setting it into the context of circular economy. And by this, I'm very sure that we will have a positive impact and that we will contribute to a less plastic in the world.
Jonas, can you tell me one key takeaway?
Thank you, Ian. I think a whole of nation approach is a key, whereby all sectors contribute to the elimination of plastic pollution in general. All stakeholders should be informed and educated through formal and informal channels, optimizing the use of information and communication technology to change behavior towards transformative business models in the use of source of materials, production and design of plastic products, the use of less single-use plastic products or unnecessary plastics, and the management of waste and recovery of material back into a circular loop. As part of the next steps, the Philippines will continue its campaign to phase out problematic single-use plastics from the hospitality industry with the aim to increase awareness among tourism stakeholders on the environmental problems created by single-use plastics, and to gradually change behavior as well as to promote already existing initiatives addressing problematic plastics being conducted by campaign partners. Thank you, Ian.
Okay, thank you. Megan, one key takeaway.
Just start, right? Just start and aim for continuous improvement, and don't be afraid to make small mistakes along the way. But I think that's the biggest one. Just take small steps, and those steps add up if your goal is continuous improvement.
Joe, final word to you.
I think, and following on from Megan, start, but take the time to think through your decisions so that they're logical, they make sense, and the changes that you make, we don't find we're solving one problem only to create another. So really take the time to make an informed decision.
Okay, thank you all, Joe, Undersecretary Leonis, Megan, Andreas. I can't recommend highly enough the report. It's really a very, very good report, and I don't say that about every report I get to read in my job. And this discussion has shown how much more there is to say, so we need to carry on discussing this and acting on it. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Ian.